afforded to men, with the worst inequalities relating to family, employment, and control of economic assets. 243 million women and girls experienced some form of abuse during lockdowns. For better and worse, the pandemic has laid bare the reality that justice systems do not work for all people. Bridging the justice gap is now not only a moral imperative, it is a public and business responsibility. And in response, we've seen business leaders across all sectors rise to the justice challenge. The Business Leaders for Justice Coalition represent the brightest rising stars, taking action, urgent action on justice issues that matter most to people. Supported by the Pathfinders, NLADA, RBIJ, and Global Citizen, this powerful coalition of business leaders will help ensure justice systems prevent and solve problems that impact people the most, particularly women and girls. It is now my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce Jamira Burley, who has kindly agreed to moderate today's session on justice for women and girls. It's our business. And before I hand it to Jamira, could I kindly ask everyone to unmute themselves as they speak? Over to you, Jamira.
Awesome. Thank you for that amazing introduction, and thank you for laying the foundation for why we are here for this very important conversation. You know, it's very easy to look at the events of the last few months and assume that it's happening in isolation, right? But what we all know to be true is that women have always bear the blunt of inequalities around the world, and COVID-19 unfortunately exacerbated much of that work. And so I'm super excited to host this conversation because I hope that it can help to inform all of those that are listening that we all have a role to play to ensure that women and girls have the resources, access, and the rights that they need in order to reach their full potential. With that being said, as mentioned, I have the pleasure of representing the Responsible Business Initiative for Justice. We believe in bringing unlikely suspects to the table to ensure that we're fighting for justice for marginalized communities here in the US. And so with that being said, I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists before we kickstart into the conversation moving forward. First up, we have Michelle Cisco, who is the Executive Director for Televerte Foundation. She is also the Chief Social Responsibility Officer. And then we have Natalie Deacon, who's the Executive Director for Corporate Affairs and Sustainability and President of Avon Foundation for Women. We have Nikki Darden, who is the Head of Internal Brand Engagement and Global Integration at Citi, as well as Rhonda Carnegie, who is the Chief Innovation Officer for the female quota, I can't get that word out. Why can't I get that word out? Quotient, yes, thank you for that. And so it's really important that I don't look past why we're having this conversation at this particular moment, right? We are in the 65th session of the status of women. And over the last few months, we've seen how women and girls have bared the blunt of the pandemic. As has been mentioned already in the introduction, women are only 2/3 of the legal rights afforded to men and are facing the worst inequalities that we've seen in decades. It's also important to note that COVID-19 sent all of our children around the world home to receive education and remote learning. More than 1.5 billion young people were impacted by that. But what we also don't talk about is that the vast majority of them were girls, and more than 20% of those girls will never return to the classroom again if we don't do something about it. I've always been a firm believer that when we invest in women and girls, we invest in their communities and we invest in them as individuals and their families. And so when we don't make those investments, we're actually not only doing the right thing, but we're also not making the most sound business decision to ensure that we're creating sustainable environments that prevents child marriage, that prevents health disparities, that prevents war. And so it's really about ensuring that those who are the most marginalized in our country and around the world have the rights that they need in order to show up accordingly. And so that's why I've always been a firm believer that everyone has a role to play, including business leaders, which is why we have this amazing panel of women leaders here today to answer some questions and hopefully provide some technical direction for how we can all play a role in ensuring that women and girls have the rights and tools and resources that they need to be an active participant in society. I want to first start off with questions with our amazing guest, Michelle, to ask her, how is girls' empowerment and justice intertwined?
Thank you so much, Jamira, and thank you for having me. I think when we talk about girls' empowerment and justice, it's really imperative that when we talk about strengthening women's rights, that we're thinking about how we're removing the barriers to opportunity, and that's critical for us to actually achieve gender equality, right? So we just heard that, women have 3/4 of the legal rights as men, and that doesn't change when they get into the justice system. It follows them all the way through the justice system, right? When they become incarcerated, the programs and the systems that are available to them are basically provided to them in the same fashion as if they were men. And, women come into the system and they have different needs, both health needs, mental health needs, physical health needs, and needs for different programs. Yet when they get there, we treat them the same way that we treat the men. And so, if we're really going to make a difference in this space of how we empower women, then we have to make sure that when they enter into the justice system, that we are addressing their unique needs and providing them with the programs and the support and the services that are unique to them, so that they are empowered to come out of the situation a better person, and be able to provide for their children, right? To reunite the families and not pass on this generational situation of incarceration that tends to occur with families.
That's a really great point. We oftentimes overlook that women bear the blunt responsibility of caring for their families. And when they're removed from the household, what are those long-term implications? When I first got asked to moderate this panel, I basically stalked all of you and the work that you're all doing. And I was highly impressed with the work of your foundation, Michelle. And so I'm curious, for those who are listening, if you can share more about how you're advancing justice for women, both internally and externally. And if you can share any specific examples so folks can get a better sense of the programs that you all offer.
Yeah, so my favorite thing to talk about. So Televerte is actually a business-to-business sales and marketing technology agency that was founded 25 years ago, based on the idea that providing women in prison with jobs, training, and real opportunity to learn and develop a career while they were incarcerated, and then follow that up with real career opportunities after release, that we could, one, build a profitable business, and two, provide the women with the marketable skills necessary to transition out of prison into a meaningful and rewarding career, be able to take care of themselves and their children. I first got involved with Televerte over 22 years ago while I was serving a 7-year sentence in the Arizona State Prison here locally. And I determined that it was the best foundation for me to rebuild my life. And so 22 years of working for the organization, I've gone from cell block to C-suite, where today I do all of our corporate social responsibility work. And then last year I was tasked with building the Televerte Foundation. And the Televerte Foundation is essentially, it's an offshoot of Televerte. So what we realized with Televerte, after 25 years of doing the work that we do, we've had over 3,000 women go through the program to achieve phenomenal results. Their employment rate is 94% employment first year after incarceration, compared to a national average of about 56%. Their salaries are 3.5, almost 4 times the national average. Putting into perspective, the national average first year earnings for a formerly incarcerated woman is $10,560. And right, so
well below the poverty level.
Yeah, way below the poverty level, right? So, and the employment rate is 5 times the national average, and that was before COVID. And so we know that the #1 predictor for recidivism is joblessness. And so we've got higher employment rates, higher salaries, which ultimately leads to a lower recidivism rate. Our 3-year recidivism rate is less than 6%. And so after 25 years of doing this, we really kind of looked at the situation and said, how do we impact more women? How do we provide more opportunities to more women? The company itself is constrained by its ability to grow. Even if we became 10 times the size that we are now, we would only be providing opportunities for about 1,000 women each year that are getting out of prison. And so we made the decision to start the foundation so that we could create scalable, repeatable models where we can go in and turn our prisons into workforce development centers by creating these virtual, online, in-person classrooms where we're training and certifying the women to become customer service, inside sales, and computer help desk professionals, and then pairing that with our proven reentry program and job placement services so that they can come out and have similar experiences and similar career opportunities as the women of Televerte. So we're really excited to be launching that. Our first Career Path Center opened this year, and the goal is to have 5 of them opened within 3 years. And then just to go from there. We really want to get to the point where we're providing this opportunity to tens of thousands of women every year, as opposed to a few hundred.
No, that's amazing. And thank you for sharing that. You know, as a child of 2 incarcerated parents, I'm quite sure that the work that you are doing are transformative, not only for the women who are in your program, but also for the families that they support back at home. So thank you for sharing that. I want to now turn quickly to Natalie. You know, I first became aware of Avon when I was a child because all of the women in my family all consumed. And, you know, Avon is oftentimes known for empowering the woman externally, but a lot of the work that you're leading is also empowering the woman internally for her to be able to not only fight back against gender-based violence. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the work that Avon is doing to address gender-based violence and the role of why it's important for businesses to engage.
Yeah, sure. And I just have to say, it's just so amazing listening to Michelle there. You know, we come along a lot across a lot of transformative stories at Avon, but Cell Block to C-Suite is one of my favorite ever. I'm going to be stalking you, Michelle, just incredible. So Jamira, why should businesses care? Yeah, there are both moral and economic arguments. Yeah, we've heard a lot of the moral arguments today, and we are probably all people who engage in those. And that's why we're on this call, because we know that 1 in 3 women and girls will be impacted by violence in their lifetime. We know that the figures are going in the wrong direction after we saw such a huge spike in domestic violence in particular, and we know we need to break that cycle, and it's rooted in deeper cultural and economic inequalities. So in terms of why business should react, yes, there are moral arguments, but of course there are also the economic arguments. So if one doesn't move you as a business, then the other certainly should, in terms of, you know, estimated 5% GDP is the cost to the economy of violence against women and girls, you know, whether that is loss of productivity in the workplace, whether it's supporting women that need it, whether it's, you know, trying to get justice outcomes. So there are lots of reasons that we shouldn't have to, but it's worth restating why businesses should care about this. And for Avon specifically, this is really embedded in our mission and who we are. So Avon is all, you know, 95% of our customers now, representatives, are women. We're committed to supporting the causes that matter to them. So yes, our basic model is around removing some of those barriers that Michelle was talking about earlier. So helping women to have an opportunity to build economic independence and build their lives. But twinned with that is a deeply ingrained commitment to tackle gender-based violence as one of the biggest issues threatening the health and well-being of women. And, you know, it's the biggest, you know, most widespread human rights violation in the world. So we have a network of 5 million representatives. So a huge part, and I can talk a little bit more about what we do, but a huge part of what we do is around raising awareness. There's also a really important part about raising funds and clearly supporting frontline NGOs with support services, but also, and you teed this up a little bit, Jamira, one of the other things that's important to us is to make sure we're walking the talk on the inside of the organization as well. And one of the things we launched just last year actually was a gender-based violence protocol for all of our own employees across the world, to make sure that this is really starting at home. And that's the kind of thing that any other business can do. You know, for us, we already have a network of 40 NGOs. We have a protocol which commits to giving people time should they need it to get help and support, and giving that paid leave, and also connecting them in with our network of NGOs. And that's the kind of protocol that any other organization can lift and shift. They can access our network, they can access our protocol. And we found, even for us, an organization that's been working in this area for a long time, it's been a huge engagement driver actually with our whole workforce to know that we're doing this, and a really great way to get people involved. So I think both, for us at Avon, both internally and externally, there are actions we can take. And I would say even for other organizations that aren't as deeply ingrained in this issue, this is fundamentally linked to broader issues around women's empowerment, women's economic participation. So the more that we can support women and other underrepresented groups in terms of building themselves and their careers and being more equal in the workplace, the more we can help to address these issues.
Thank you for that, Natalie. And I'm curious, in regards to the programs that you've mentioned so far, is there any results that you've seen that keeps Avon continuing to stay engaged with this work?
Yeah, I think there's both the quant and the qual, as my friends in market research would say. So, there's most definitely, it's great to have the big numbers. So, we've donated over $80 million now to NGOs across the world. We've helped hundreds of thousands of women directly. We have a Justice Institute program that we run with Vital Voices, where we conduct justice institutes across the world, which really help to bring together the various parties involved to help women secure better justice outcomes. And those programs have reached millions of people in terms of building awareness and bringing groups together. So it's really terrific to see those specific results. As much as that, one of the most powerful things for us actually is the less tangible. So as I say, the qual that goes with the quant, in terms of last year we donated in response to the spike in domestic violence as a result of COVID-19, we donated an additional $1 million to 40 NGOs in the countries where we operate. And we're just coming to the anniversary of that. And even just speaking to a colleague last week in Turkey, she said that grant was the thing that made the single biggest difference to the work that they do last year. And that is, it's not it doesn't ladder up to a huge number. It's sometimes really difficult to articulate the impact. And for us, it's about, we have this network of 5 million women, many of whom have been impacted by this issue. And actually, even now, when I hear those individual stories of a woman who has found herself in a difficult situation, often kind of second, third generation of the cycle of violence, and being able to find a way out, whether that's through having support from an NGO that we fund, whether it's through getting kind of a foot onto the work ladder and changing her life. It's those stories that really keep us motivated and keep us knowing that we're on the right path.
I'm happy that you talked about solutions, not just through statistics, but also through the real world stories that can add texture to the solutions we need to create, because it is about the people, right? It's about the stories, about the communities that they come from, and how that can be transformed through the work of organizations like yours. So I appreciate you laying that foundation. And also, I'm excited that you mentioned Vital Voices. I'm a huge fan of Vital Voices, and I've participated in a number of their programs. And it's a prime example, to your point, of that companies can work with local organizations to build those collaborative programs to impact the women and girls who need those resources. So thanks for highlighting that work. I now want to turn to both Nikki and Rhonda, because the work that you all are doing is absolutely phenomenal. And I want to start first with Rhonda and ask, can you tell us about your approach at Female Quotient and to tackling the gender pay gap? And what has changed in recent years around the discussion of how we should be approaching this issue as a coalition, as a private sector actors, and as civil societies?
Great, Amira. Well, the female quotient, really works to advance equality in the workplace. And we do that through the power of collaboration, knowledge sharing, and moving ideas to action. And so, one of the things that Natalie Deacon said from the Avon Foundation is she talked about the impact of GDP and why businesses should care about the importance of removing barriers. And I want to build on that and talk about the importance of raising awareness. So we know that pay parity is a critical driver of equality. And as the world grapples with the pandemic that threatens to undo decades of progress, it's never been more important for organizations to take a stand for equality. And so what we heard from Fortune 500 companies, along with actually small and medium-sized business executives, is an interest in learning about how to talk about closing the gap. And what are the real actions that people can take? And what are the factors that impact a community's ability to close the gaps or accelerate that change? And so as we realize that we're framing this idea of closing the equity pay gap, that there were these questions about how do we talk about the subject as a private sector actor and civil society advocate community? And it was a realization that the conversation was changing. It was moving from the human resources and legal governance approach to more of a democratized conversation within organizations, across organizations. And we also heard questions about how businesses can engage in pay equity without being performative, which is really important. And then ultimately, how do we empower transparency through data and communication?
Led us right into our next question with Nikki. Nikki, as a powerful example at Citi, you're doing the work that you're doing to support gender equality and justice for women is recognizing, one, the gender pay gap as a true barrier to broader equity. So I'm curious, Citi was the first major international financial institution to voluntarily release their data regarding the gender gap data. And you're working with Female Quotient to, support the development of this fantastic tool. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about, one, why you all decided to do this, but then two, what are some of the lessons you've learned in addressing these issues over the years?
Yeah, thank you, Jamira, for the question. Great to be here. I think what's clear is we've seen a lot of progress that's happening for women around the world. We just saw the first woman sworn in as Vice President of the United States by the first Latina Supreme Court Justice, while the first female Speaker of the House looked on. And we're seeing women at the helm of global institutions like the European Central Bank and the World Trade Organization. And these are all very inspiring things and developments that we're seeing. But as we celebrate those accomplishments, we have to think about the fact that women make up half of the global population, but are so underrepresented at every level in corporate America, or I should say of the corporate ladder, even globally. And they consistently earn less than their male counterparts. So you add to that what multiple people, including yourself, mentioned already, the impact of the pandemic that is having, a disparate portion or disparate effect on women. 500,000 more women have left the U.S. labor force than men since the beginning of the pandemic. 50 million women and girls are being pushed into poverty as a result of COVID. So layer that on to the already existing systemic issues within sort of the work world, the corporate world. So we decided that we were going to share and disclose our own pay data. And at the time that we did it, you are right, we were the first. Not many have followed, which is frankly why we're partnering with the Female Quotient to do this work. But the data revealed what our CEO is calling an ugly number, right? We were being transparent, and that is keeping us accountable. Within Citi, women and men are paid equally for the same job. I think you will find that in a lot of corporations, that's true. But where the gap is access and representation at every level. So higher earning jobs tend to have less female representation. So when you look at the raw pay data, that becomes painfully obvious. So we did this with all of the power of Citi, the analysts and economists that work here and can really bring that thought leadership to bear for our own data. But not every corporation, not every company has those resources, particularly if we think about how many people are employed by small and mid-sized companies around the world. They don't necessarily have those same resources that they can bring forth. And so that's what this tool does. The Advancing Equality Calculator is a free tool, a digital tool that companies can use to measure their own wage gap. And they can see in the data, where those disparities are and understand the impact, as Rhonda talked about before, not just on GDP, but on their own profitability. And so that becomes very real. And the data gives you power to act, to correct, and to fix the problem. We've got a goal of closing the pay gap and have set, representation goals in senior level and higher paid positions that we're focusing on by the end of this year. And it's extremely aggressive and it makes me nervous every day. But really having the data and being clear on what that is what enables us to push forward and know what direction we need to go in.
Oh, that's super exciting. And I'm happy you highlighted the women leaders and how far we've come in regards to women actually taking the mantle to lead in a range of different industries. I also want to point out for those who are watching, if we look at over the last 12 months, the countries that are led by women have actually been much more progressive, as well as has survived in much better conditions than those led by men. No shade to the men, but facts are facts. Data is what it is. So I want to expand on that, those points that you made, Nikki, and ask Rhonda if she could talk a little bit about this particular tool, the Advancement Equity Calculator, and what does our audience need to know about this tool and how we can all engage with it?
Okay, thank you. I realized that I've been muted. Yes, thank you. Don't want to be mute. Don't want to be a woman muted. That is for sure. First of all, I just wanted to respond to the comment that you made. And, we were talking about the female quotient. We think whenever there is a woman in the equation, we can work to advance equality. So I'm just was cheering you on for that comment. So thank you for that. For us, one of the questions that we get all the time is, if I input my data, will there be anonymity? And I think that that's really important to say that, the data is yours to own, it's yours to have. So when you put it in, it's private. So I think that that's important. The other thing that's important to note is that the more data we can really collect, the more we can do benchmarking. And what we want to do is to attach, 3 easy inputs to tell you where you are collectively to help move things forward with GDP, and also to make that connection, and then also to showcase what accelerated progress will be. So if McKinsey said it's going to take us 257 years to close the wage gap, which we do not want to wait, companies can then see what they can do to accelerate change in a shorter amount of time. So again, the most important thing for us to tell people is that we build this tool to be a free tool. It's not meant to be, a path to, consultants, telling you. It's really meant to be, how it's really going to help to address the pay gap. So it really gives you that information. And we believe that we wanted to create a tool that was easy to use and was able to create, transparency. So.
Awesome. And I just wanted to see, Nikki, if you had anything you wanted to add to Rhonda's point.
Not really. Rhonda covered it all. The one thing I'd like to point out is that and this is, the lesson that Citi has learned, the transparency drives accountability. And so if we're going to move things forward, we've got to be accountable. And when you know your numbers, and to Rhonda's point, they're private, you don't need to make that public. That's your data. But when you know the numbers, it is hard to deny them and not take action.
No, that's a really great point. And we've seen over the last few months a number of companies make very grandiose statements. And I know a lot of people have been pushing back, asking for the data, because that's where whether or not these solutions, this funding, the implications of what is happening is going to really show whether or not it's transforming the communities in the way in which we hope it is. So that's a really great point. I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have any questions, please use the chat box to ask them. We'll try to get to them before the end of the program. I've already seen a number of them come in for our speakers, so we'll be sure to flag as soon as we start that audience question section. I want to now open it up to all the panelists and ask, you know, as I mentioned before, we've seen a number of companies make a lot of grand statements, most of them over the last few months that have been around racial equity and social justice. And women, of course, are a part of that equation. But if we don't say women, and girls enough, and that they have to be at the center of change, we know that oftentimes they will be overlooked. So why should businesses and why are businesses a key driver to advancing social justice for women and closing the gender justice gap? And any one of you can feel free to start. I'm gonna pick on Michelle. She looked like she had a comment.
I forgot to unmute. So, you know, I was just listening to a podcast last week, and they were talking about the unemployment numbers, and they were talking about the unemployment numbers, although they may look okay, are not stating the real truth. They said that when we take into consideration the women who have had to drop out of the workforce because of COVID, because of the industries that they work in, because of the children, because of all the different things, that the unemployment rate is so much higher. So there's a whole piece of, you know, the justice piece aside, there's just women in general right now are being overlooked, the impact of COVID on women in general. And then when we bring the justice aspect into it, you know, I just said this on something that I was in yesterday, is that, you know, we can't expect the government to solve this problem. It's been their problem for ever. And we can't expect the nonprofits to solve this problem by themselves, right? So the nonprofits can do a lot of work. The only way that we're ever going to get ourselves out of this situation with the incarceration, the recidivism rate, the growing incarceration rate, like we all know the numbers, is the female incarceration has increased 750% just in, you know, the last 15 years. And I've witnessed it personally just right here in the state of Arizona. When I went to prison 25 years ago, there was about 1,200 women in prison. And today, the same state, we have 4,300 women in prison, right? 81,000 women get out of prison every year. 1.9, you add the jails into the situation, 1.9 million women are getting out of prison and jails every year. 4 out of 5 of them are mothers. The impact of women women with a criminal record not being able to have and maintain gainful employment just creates so many barriers that barriers to their own success, barriers to the success of the children, and barriers to the economic development of our own communities. And so businesses need to take action and say, how do we remove these barriers, and how do we empower the women? How do we support the nonprofits and the NGOs in their efforts to advance programs that empower the women to make a difference? And so it's just time for all of us to come together and work on this problem together.
And if I could just add to what Michelle said, which I think is spot on, the 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer, just speaking from the corporate perspective, says that people have greater trust in corporations than they do in governments.
Yes.
And for the first time, even in NGOs. And I say that just to say, not only are all the things that Michelle just laid out the right thing to do, but it's what our customers and clients expect of us, because we are the ones who have both the resources and the capabilities and competency to drive solutions forward. So it's in not only the best interest of communities for us to do this work, but it's also in our best interest as corporations.
That's a really great point in regards to sustainability. And I'll also add, as someone who works specifically with and for youth, 80% of young people actually say that business success should be measured by more than profit. And so to your point, the long game requires corporations kind of having a public voice that speaks about these inequalities, especially those that impact those who are the most marginalized, women and girls. So thank you for that point, Nikki. There's a really great question that we have from our audience that I want to get you all's perspective. The theme for the Commission for the Status of Women this year is public life and equal participation in decision making. As powerful women in the business community, what are your top recommendations for unlocking more leadership for women through the justice lens? And if I can start with you, Rhonda, because I've been to a number of girl lounges, and you all never are too shy to ask business leaders how they can step up and do more. So I'd be curious to hear your perspective.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about Vital Voices and about, all of these organizations that are doing amazing work. And I think what you're referring to, which is so true at the female quotient, we're coalition builders. So if we all look at the work we're doing in our individual groups, then that's great. But where we begin to be powerful is when we begin to connect the dots between, Michelle's work, between everyone's work, and we begin to amplify, share best practices, and share those ideas. So I also think that we're seeing the importance of innovation in government. We've got to get more women in government, more women having a seat at the table of having these important conversations, and just lastly, in terms of the corporate sector and just seeing where we're moving with sustainable investing and everything that's going on with climate, and really understanding the intersectional aspects of all these issues, it's going to require justice, climate justice. Justice will be at the center of this intersectional thinking. And so I'm glad the theme is this at this time, and I'm glad to see so many amazing women stepping up to take a leadership position.
And I would just go back to the point that Nikki made a few moments ago about the weight of expectation upon business now. That's the key to unlocking leadership. And that has accelerated beyond recognition in the last 12 months. So the expectation that companies now go beyond surface purpose, but really deeply ingrain this in their ways of working, I think is really the game changer right now. I just think that has gone from being something with kind of a superficial tick box exercise to something that is absolutely real and tangible. So I think that's a really important shift. The other thing I think we have to be really careful of always is that we don't fall into the trap of a group of women talking to other women about women's problems. It's one of my biggest bugbears that time and time again I find myself just, I've been in a room full of like 1,000 women all talking about how awful it is that women aren't in more leadership positions or are victims of gender-based violence. And if women are only talking to other females about it, we're just not going to get anywhere. So we need to engage across organizations, but also make sure we've got plenty of male superstars on the journey with us.
And that's a really great point, Natalie. The idea that the work really requires male voices to show up as authentic, not just allies, but accomplices in this work. I'm curious for you all, while we think about all of the opportunities for corporations to get involved in these efforts and to speak up on behalf of this work, it would be remiss of me not to mention that there are barriers to why companies don't engage. And I'm curious for you all, one of the barriers is that companies are afraid of getting it wrong. So what would you say to individual business leaders as well as organizations who are thinking about engaging in closing the gender gap for women about why they shouldn't fear either getting it wrong or not always having the right thing to say?
I'll jump in. I think silence is deafening. I think exactly what Natalie just said, the level of expectation right now is so high that not stepping up and taking your part is noticeable to consumers, and consumers are choosing brands that stand by and believe in the same things as they believe in. And so, we rolled out an initiative last year that was focused on trans visibility, right? And what we learned through that initiative is, well, one, we're not always going to get it right, but also that there is grace from communities when you are actively trying to do the right thing and you continue and consistently demonstrate that. You do get some grace to sometimes get it wrong. Now, when you step up and it's the first time you said something and you went a little left with it, things might not turn out so great. But when you are actively engaging with communities and honestly, trying to solve problems and making them part of just how you do business, there's a lot of grace that gets extended to you. I think cancel culture is a little bit of a myth in that way. I just, will say in that, yes, it's real, but you always see these exceptions where it's like, well, this person has been doing the right thing, and so maybe we won't cancel them, right? And that's what it comes from, building up that credibility with communities all along.
Thank you for that. Anyone else?
I wanted to build on something that Nikki was saying, and this is, my work with both the private sector and the public sector. And one of my favorite TED Talks was when Melinda Gates said in her work, what could she learn from Coca-Cola? And I think just really understanding that the private sector is thinking about how to reach lots of consumers, how to use distribution channels for information. And so I do believe, in the spirit of your original question, that it is a reciprocal relationship between the private sector, the public sector, and NGOs that will allow us to get to the places that we need to get to.
Thank you for that. So as we all know, COVID-19 is still kicking all of our butts in many different ways, and it will continue to be a barrier to the economic recovery for many cities, countries around the world. Why should we zero in focus on gender issues as a part of that recovery, especially as we help to lay the foundation for why those who are on this call should get involved and to encourage their other business leaders to engage in this work as well. And we'd love to start with some of our business reps on the line to talk a little bit more about that. Not sure if Michelle wants to jump in, or maybe Natalie.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. I touched on this a little bit, right? So the women have actually been the hardest hit as it relates to COVID and the recovery, right? So we have to, and employment is the issue. And I always go back to when we empower women to develop the skills and join the global workforce and advance in the global workforce, we empower them to have a better life. We empower their children to have a better life. And we, it's all circular, right? We improve our communities. We improve the economic outcomes for everybody involved. And so, one of the things that before COVID, I was probably on this call last year, which was maybe right before COVID. We were talking a lot about the growing skills gap in our country, right? And that there were, $85 trillion in unrealized GDP was what we were going to realize from the growing skills gap, and that we needed to start to look at we needed to start to look at the people who are justice involved. 1 in 3 people in the US have a criminal record with a 5 times higher unemployment rate. So we have to start to look into that community to address that growing skills gap. My greatest fear is that, the impact of COVID and the unemployment and what that's done is, what is that going to do to our growing skills gap? And then how does that further impact the people who are, justice involved, who are negatively impacted by whether it's their gender, whether it's their criminal record, whether it's their race. And so we have to look at economic equality for all. And that's where businesses have to come in and really, everybody wants to talk about diversity and inclusion, right? And it was once said that, diversity is, inviting somebody to the party, but inclusion is actually asking them to dance. And so when companies are working on their diversity and inclusion, it needs to be, and Natalie, I'm going to steal this from you, right? It needs to not be surface, it needs to be purpose. And they need to say, when I'm talking about diversity and inclusion, that means including everybody. I'm making sure everyone is being asked to dance, and I'm not overlooking people with a criminal record, particularly women with a criminal record, and women of color with a criminal record actually have the highest unemployment rate of anyone with a criminal record. And so it's time for us to make that part of our diversity and inclusion call.
That's a really great point, Michelle, and I really appreciate you bringing up skills because, I don't want to alarm anyone, but with robotics and automation taking up, transforming many of our industries, we know that the hardest hit communities are going to be communities of color and women who are not being reskilled, are not gaining the necessary tools that they need in order to participate in the workforce. So it has the potential to be devastating if we don't to address it front and center. So thank you for that. We have another question from the audience, and it taps into a little bit of what we talked about in regards to male allies. I want Aaron, thank you for this question. It talks about, I love to explore how to engage more male champions and justice for women. How can we help move from performative to more impactful engagement? Any advice from any of your personal experiences? Or do we just want men to cut the check and move out of the way?
Do I think it's so important that for both men and women, and people that might not identify as either, that we don't overlook the need to state the need to still focus on gender for starters. And I think actually focusing on issues of intersectionality now is a really important starting point for making sure we continue to look at gender. I think this is why things like looking at equal pay is so important, because the data speaks for itself, because there is a tendency, I think, in some places of the world, I'm sitting in the UK, people think gender's done here. They don't think it's an issue anymore. Culturally, even what I see in gender pay reporting doesn't reflect my felt experience. So how is that going to feel for my male colleagues? So I think it's really important that we don't forget to state the case. And I also think it's really important that we make it clear that we always say at Avon, a better world for women is a better world for everyone. So regardless of whether we're focusing on gender or other issues, if you make the world better for everybody, then everybody improves. And when it comes to leadership, economic participation, there's a big enough pie here for everyone. Nobody is going to miss out by empowering women and empowering other groups. And I think that's one of the really important things in terms of engaging men and bringing them on the journey. That we make sure that it's absolutely clear there's no threat, and this is not a them against us. This isn't anybody having to share their piece of the pie. There's enough to go around.
I'd also like to add on to that, because like we said, there's not enough men who are getting involved, and I don't know if that's because we're not inviting them to the table, if we're not encouraging them. It's like you said earlier about, it's all white women talking, or it's all just women, not just necessarily white women, but all talking to each other about the issues. And we need to bring the men to the table. My husband is one who mentions it all the time. He does a lot of work with me, with the foundation, with Televerte, with the women, because one of the reasons why he says he gets involved is because he believes that for the women and the girls that are in this situation, they actually need to see male role models. They need to see men that are having a positive impact. They need to learn to have relationships with men in a meaningful way, because so many times they either didn't have relationships with men, or the relationships they've had with men have been unhealthy. And so we have to start showing a different way. And one of the ways that we have to do that is by involving the men in the conversations, in the programs, and in the activities that we're bringing to our women and girls.
Yeah, I just want to say, it really is about empowering. And so if we say it's not, a male issue or a female issue, but it's really a conscious leadership issue, and that it's about conscious leaders moving this forward and figuring out how we work together, then I totally agree with what Natalie and Michelle are saying. We need having more men to the table and being part of the bigger solution is exactly the way that we need to go, and to take a look at this as a problem that we can all solve together, a socioeconomic problem, and having more perspectives and more people at the table to have these conversations will allow us to move faster.
Thank you for that. And I just want to touch on Natalie's point, the idea of there's enough for us all to have of the pie, right? The idea, we've been told that there's a scarcity of resources and opportunities, when that is false. And so how can we push back and demand more oftentimes from the institutions to do for our communities? Because to your point, we all can benefit when we create opportunities and resources for everyone and not just the chosen few. So I have one final question before we end, and I'm going to ask each of you to answer it. If you can answer, why should the audience join and support the Business Leaders for Justice Coalition? And what is one way in which they can get engaged in the efforts to close the gap for women? And I'll start with Nikki.
Great, thank you, Jamira. I think in terms of the why, if you think about your client base, your potential client base, whatever it may be, 50% of them are women, or could be. And I think to actively ignore such a significant portion of opportunity, of community, of society is not going to advance any of us. And when I think about how they can get involved, I think the first step is to understand the data, whether that's pay data, whether that's sort of what your own organization looks like, whether that's expanding. I love Michelle's point about expanding the definition of diversity to include, formerly incarcerated people. Like, however it is, understand sort of what's happening in your own world, in your own walls. And just get really clear and uncomfortable with those answers. And I really think that's the first step to taking positive action here.
Awesome. Michelle? Oh, I think you're muted.
Of course I am. Somebody had to do it, right? Somebody had to be the one to forget to take themselves off mute. But I was just saying that I think Nikki's right. The first step for businesses is to understand what's happening in their organization, right? Because you can't do anything if you don't really know what the truth is. Then make decisions to say, okay, let's fix what's wrong, right? Because there's something wrong in every organization, right? So let's fix what's wrong. But then let's go one step further and say, how do we either develop programs that bring people into our organization? How do we support the programs that are making a difference in our communities? Like, be proactive in finding the things that are, specific to where you are and where your company is. Like, not just what's happening in your company, what's happening in your industry. Right? And what are the areas that you can actually drive change that will bring the kind of the disempowered into your organization in a meaningful way, right? Yes, you can throw money at the problem, and I'm right here. I'll take your money, right? Like, if that's your solution, I'll take your money and I'll go empower a bunch of women to go work in your industry. Like, that's what I do. But be prepared to say, okay, how do I do more than just throw money at the problem? How do I represent the change that needs to happen?
Thank you for that. Natalie?
would totally echo what's already been said, so I don't know if I can beat either of those. Why, as I said earlier, there's a moral argument here and there's an economic argument. And whenever I'm talking to my colleagues in marketing, I always say, for us, the women's agenda is at the heart of our sustainability goals, but it's also at the heart of our commercial goals. So, to frame what Nikki said in a slightly different way, this is what's good for the world, but it's also, this is about sustainability of the business and the world. So that's the why. I think in terms of the how, find easy ways, and to Michelle's point, inexpensive ways of getting involved. So something like our gender-based violence protocol that we implemented last year didn't cost us anything, and other organizations can lift it. And find ways to engage your employees. So last year we recreated some employee resource groups. So we now have organizations across the company who are focused on issues around inclusion. So whether it's ability, whether it's LGBTI, whether it's race, we now have these groups within our organization, and they can do a much better job than the leadership of keeping this on the agenda and fighting for it and kind of driving that at a grassroots level. So easy, non-costly ways to do stuff.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Rhonda.
Yeah, I think everyone said such a good way of articulating the why. So I'll just go into the how to say, 2 points that I think are really important. One, you can put yourself at the center of this conversation. It doesn't have to be your company or someone else in your company. You can actually take a seat at the table and create change. And one of the things that we know, for example, with the calculator itself, is that you can just look at your team, your group. You can look at that information. It doesn't have to be the information from your overall company. So I would say be proactive in your position and raise your hand and get involved and have your voice be heard. So important during this time. And then the second, build bridges. We've heard about the amazing work that's being done. Build bridges between the work that you're doing and the work of others. And I think in that the solutions are available for us to move at speed.
Thank you for that. I want to shout out and thank all of our amazing panelists, not only for sharing their stories, but for giving so much amazing insight to the work that they're doing at their individual organizations and companies. So join with me in thanking them for participating in today's program. I also, it's important that all of our speakers talked about that this is not the time to hide our heads in the sand and hope that someone else is going to do the work. All of us have a role to play, either in our individual capacity or the work that we're leading in our organization. So look for ways to step up and do something. Otherwise, you will be, I think, left behind as more individuals continue to demand more from our leaders, and particularly our private sector, to engage in this work. I also want to thank everyone for attending this event. You could have been anywhere in the world, and actually you probably are as you're tuning in, but this conversation was important, and hopefully all of you gained some new insight and ways to get involved. It's really important that if you're looking for ways to continue to be a part of this process, to learn more about the Business Leaders for Justice Coalition. They are the amazing organizers behind putting this event together, including our partners at Pathfinders, as well as the National Legal Aid and Defenders Association, Global Citizens, and the Responsible Business Initiative for Justice. And so if you want to learn more information, check out their website, as well as stay up to date for future events in the near future. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Jamira Burley, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Now I'm going to go have coffee.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.